There are people out there building incredible applications with Ionic, but when it comes to building out your own application, you might feel underwhelmed with the result and end up wondering,
why doesn't mine look like that?
In this new series, we're going to be taking a look at some of the best Ionic applications out there and getting insight from the people who built them. This first video is going to focus on user experience and the work that Cory McArthur has been doing with Sworkit and OneGoal. Cory is a UX engineer at Sworkit and has been building out OneGoal as a solo founder and developer. I've been chatting with Cory over the past couple of weeks to gather information for this video and hopefully transplant some wisdom from his head into yours. Sworkit has been growing since its inception in 2012 and would eventually become one of the top 5 fitness apps on both the iOS App Store and Google Play. Originally created by Ryan Hanna and later acquired by Nexercise, it has long been a shining beacon of what can be done with Ionic. Sworkit provides at-home workout instructions for people of all ages and has been translated into 13 different languages. It's available on iOS, Android, the web, and there is also a separate Apple TV app and Apple Watch app. Now in terms of the tech stack for Sworkit, it uses stenciljs, both as a framework for building the application and to create custom components. It of course uses Ionic for most of its UI components. They're using Stencil Redux for global state management, Capacitor for connecting to native functionality and creating native builds. They're using Amplitude for app analytics, Firebase Auth and Firestore, Google Cloud Storage for images and video, and their web app is deployed using Netlify. Cory McArthur officially launched OneGoal in 2019 as an alternative to budgeting applications he and his wife had tried, but ultimately had been dissatisfied with. Rather than just reporting your spending and savings habits, OneGoal uses a cash envelope style of budgeting where you fund specific budgets from your paycheck and then spend from those budgets. OneGoal will convert your income and expenses into a weekly budget, which Cory has found to be much easier to stick with rather than trying to manage the budget for a whole month at a time. OneGoal's tech stack closely resembles Sworkit's. It is also primarily built with Ionic components, and it uses stenciljs both as a framework for the application and to create custom components. It also uses Redux, Amplitude, Firebase, and one of the main differences is that OneGoal is using Plaid for connecting with the customer's bank accounts to get that data into the application. So with the introductions out of the way, let's start looking at what makes the user interface and user experience of Sworkit and OneGoal so good. Animations are not the most important thing when it comes to designing a good user experience, but let's be real, cool animations are a big part of creating that wow factor for an application. Cory pointed out that the important thing is that an animation creates movement that has purpose. Movement will draw the user's attention, and if it's not purposeful, it can detract from the experience rather than adding to it. OneGoal is a great example of an application that uses fun animations well. The animations in OneGoal help it achieve another important aspect that Cory mentioned, and that is considering how you want your application to make the user feel. Let's take a close look at how OneGoal uses animations in a somewhat complex user interaction to both achieve a specific feeling and also provide helpful feedback to the user. What we are looking at on screen is an example of a user breaking and then fixing a budget. The user has a $165 expense that they are taking from their clothing budget. However, their clothing budget only has $129 available, and so the budget explodes. This is a serious situation, and the UI does a good job of communicating this. Preventing the spending of more money than you have available is one of the key purposes of the application. So it makes sense to make a big deal out of this. So how does the app make a big deal? Let's watch it again and pay close attention. So first, the clothing budget very clearly shakes. A popover with a warning appears. The clothing budget explodes dramatically. and then an alert is displayed explaining that you broke your budget and suggests fixing it now. Basically, the application kicks up one big stink about what just happened that enforces the idea that this is a big deal. So how does one fix a budget? It sounds pretty complicated. So OneGoal continues to hold the user's hand through this process as it walks through fixing the budget. The user can select a different budget, in this case gas money, to make up the difference required to balance out the clothing budget. Once the budget is fixed, a celebratory confetti animation plays. This is the sort of animation that could be pointless, but it plays an effective role here. It makes the user feel accomplished by having their budget in balance now, and it gives feedback to the user that everything is all good. Without the confetti animation, the user might still be left wondering if they had actually successfully fixed the budget or not. And I think this is especially useful as a bit of an onboarding experience when you aren't really familiar with how the application works in intimate details just yet. So these two animations help make what is typically a boring chore of balancing a budget into something that is a bit more fun and approachable. The other animation I want us to take a look at is the scroll animation that is on screen now. This one doesn't fulfill any particularly practical purpose, but it does look really cool, and since the animation is tied to a scroll, it isn't being unnecessarily distracting by grabbing the user's attention away from anything else that they might be doing. What we certainly don't want to be doing for an animation like this is have it negatively affect the performance of the application. And when we are tying an animation to scroll events, we need to be particularly careful about that. So why do we need to be careful in that circumstance? Unlike a click event that might fire once, scroll events might fire hundreds of times in a small space of time. If we are performing a resource-intensive task in response to these events, like manipulating the DOM in some way, things can go bad pretty quickly. Cory highlighted two important aspects he keeps in mind for creating performant animations, and those are to use CSS transforms like scale, translate, and rotate for animations wherever possible, and to use request animation frame to prevent jitter. I don't want to go off on a tangent about why those things are important, so I will link to some additional resources below that explain these concepts. And I do also have an entire book on creating performant animations and interactions with Ionic if you want to check that out. So I will link to that in the description as well. So what we are going to do right now is take a look at a live version of this scroll animation that Cory kindly provided for us. And I'll also have a link in the description to a live demo and source code for this that you can play around with yourself. I have Cory's code running in this demo stenciljs application. Obviously, it doesn't have all the bells and whistles that the OneGoal app itself has, but I just want to focus on this header element and give you the basic idea of how it works. So it looks like we have this very sort of complex header component here with all these fancy waves going on, and of course it's animated as we scroll. If I just scroll down quickly here, we can see this is what the header looks like when the animation is finished, once we've scrolled down far enough to get past that. But all we ever really have here is just the standard Ion toolbar component, and then there is an SVG beneath that that is being animated. So right now, it has no height, it's not currently visible, so we just have the normal header. But all that happens is that this SVG is overlaying the normal header here and animating as that happens. And even the way to achieve this is quite simple, because all we need to do is scale the SVG as a whole. Since it is an SVG, you could do all sorts of fancy things, like targeting specific elements within that SVG. But in this case, we can just scale the whole thing to create that effect. So you'll see if we inspect the SVG, you'll see that currently it has a scale Y of 1. So if I just go ahead and manually change this value, you can see there I accidentally just set it to 3, which makes it look quite crazy. But let's set it back to 1. And as we go down in increments, let's go to 0.8 and then 7, 6, 5, 4. You can see how the SVG is shrinking and creating that effect that we see in the full animation. So all we need to do is just do this smoothly whilst we scroll to create that effect. So if you just keep an eye on the element.style selector over in the DevTools, you'll notice that if I just say scroll a little bit, it's automatically had its scale set to the appropriate value, and there's some calculations going on to figure out what that value should be, but it should be performant because all we're doing is animating a transform value, a CSS transform, which is relatively cheap to animate. If we were trying to animate something like height, it would be much more expensive and we'd probably get much worse performance. So again, if you do want to see the full code, see exactly how these values are calculated, you will find a link to that in the description. When I asked if there are any particular areas that Cory had spent a lot of time focusing on improving, he said, when shipping a new feature or page, I try to make sure that every state is accounted for, especially loading states. I never display a blank screen when content is loading. I either have skeleton views or a pleasant loading animation. Sometimes we can easily skip past the various states our application might be in and just focus on the obvious or ideal states. Consider a typical loading example. What states might we need to account for? You might initially think of an unloaded state and a loaded state, and sometimes that is all that might be handled in the application. But there is an entire set of states that our application might be in that include unloaded, loaded, load failed, load succeeded, load retrying, and depending on what your application is doing specifically, there might be other states to think of as well. So it's important to provide a pleasant experience throughout all of these states rather than just the main ones. And arguably it's even more important to focus on those sort of edge case states, things like load failed, because those are probably the states that are going to frustrate the user the most. So to give you a direct example from Sworkit, notice how they are using skeleton content whilst music from Spotify loads in. This provides a nice transition for unavoidable load time, and this sort of feature would fall into the realm of perceived performance. It doesn't make anything load any quicker, but it makes the experience nicer overall, and it creates this feeling that things are actually faster than they are. So the skeleton content helps the transition between those unloaded and loaded states and just makes that whole process feel a lot more smooth. The worst experience here would be to just have a blank page, which is exactly what Cory said he never does. The next best thing would be to have something like a loading spinner, which at least indicates that something is happening that the user should be waiting for. But then the skeleton screen is even better because it both helps indicate that something is happening, something is loading, and it helps smooth that transition between the two states. So what exactly is the best approach for any particular circumstance might vary, but the important thing is to make sure you think about every state the application can be in and what the user's experience might be throughout those states. Sworkit is a great example of an application that tailors the experience well to different screen sizes. And this is especially important for an application like Sworkit, where the likelihood of the users using different devices is much higher. You can imagine that a user might want to work out in their office with a full screen desktop computer available. They might want to work out in the park with a mobile phone, maybe at home with an iPad. So it's important that the app works well on all of these devices. So making the application look good on all of these different screen sizes is important, but there is also potential to improve the user experience through making use of the extra screen real estate available, say, on an iPad screen. A great example of this is Sworkit's workout screen. So take a look at how the workout appears on larger screen sizes. Not only are there style customizations for this size, but the extra space is being utilized at the bottom to display upcoming exercises. It's also important to tailor your call to action, which is the action you want a user to take on a particular page, to suit the experience of the device you are working with. So you can see an example of how Sworkit handles this on small and large screens for their workout selection page. The phone-sized page has the call to action in a sticky footer, which is a typical pattern for mobile, but the larger version has the call to action in the header section. The code to make customizations like this is also often quite simple. In this particular case, it is just a matter of using a media query to hide and display different buttons at particular breakpoints. Another important aspect to consider is how the user might typically use their application. Where will they be? How will they interact with the device? What else might they be doing? What might be going on in the environment around them? A user might be using the application whilst laying on the couch, or they might use it whilst walking, or maybe they'll be interacting with a mounted device in a hotel lobby. Users of Sworkit are most likely going to be working out whilst using the application. Therefore, it's important that it is designed to work well in that context. An important consideration here might be that it will be difficult for the user to interact with the application whilst working out. So minimizing or eliminating the need to interact with the application physically is important. Let's take a look at Sworkit's workout component to see how they handle this, and we will also consider in general what other user interface and user experience elements are playing a role. So I'm going to let this play through in silence, highlighting some things as we go, and then we will discuss it briefly afterward.
Here we go. We'll start off with a warm-up to get things moving. Step touch. Begin. Place your hands on your hips to help you keep your hips level. Side step side to side, maintaining good posture. Next exercise, the saw. 3, 2, 1, the saw. Begin.
This is clearly a process that the Sworkit team have spent some time optimizing. There are quite a few interesting things happening that I have highlighted, but the key elements that would make this application easier to use in the context of a workout are audio instructions, video instructions, a large timer that would be visible from far away, a transition time between exercises, and the fact that the exercises autoplay one after the other. Another aspect that I like about this is that the users would become less reliant on the application over time and would gain more freedom in their workouts. Once you are familiar with the exercises, just being able to hear the audio instructions, which include the time remaining, would be enough to perform your workout. And as Cory also mentioned, what the users are really buying is the better version of themselves. They're not really buying your app. They're buying what the app can do for them. And this would be a great example of that, where the application is helping the user become better at working out. Ionic provides a lot out of the box, and you can certainly make a productive and performant application with just the default controls. But if you want something that stands out and provides the best user experience possible, you are probably going to need to create your own custom components, or at least very heavily tailor the Ionic components. This will allow you to achieve a more unique look, and it will also allow you to tailor the components to suit the use case for your application more closely. Although creating a unique and tailored experience can lead to great results, Cory also makes sure to focus on the importance of following platform-specific UX patterns. This is something that Ionic does great out of the box, and you don't want to mess with that too much. Cory suggested focusing on 4 main points in this regard, and that is to use the appropriate iconography for the platform. For example, the share icons between iOS and Android are different, and these are things that the users already know and are familiar with. You should follow the platform's navigation paradigms, again, the way iOS and Android transition between pages and display modals is different. You should use platform-specific design elements, again, staying consistent with the types of elements the users are expecting to see. And again, make sure that you're designing appropriately for all the different screen sizes. When creating custom components, we want to make sure we are working with and adding to the underlying platform by creating experiences that seamlessly integrate with everything else. We don't want to reinvent the wheel and force our own paradigms onto the user. In one of his presentations on UX, Cory included a quote from one of the co-founders at Intercom, which is especially relevant here. "Not everything is worth learning. It's so arrogant of our industry to think that every customer wants to learn every novel UI pattern we create. Unless you have a very good reason to, you should work with the patterns the user is already comfortable with rather than making them learn how to use your application specifically." Let's take a look at a particularly impressive custom component that Cory has been working on at Sworkit. Calendars are notoriously hard to do well, but this custom approach looks great and works great with the experience that Sworkit is trying to create. The component ties seamlessly into the activity log below. Selecting a particular day will load in any activities logged for that day, and you can also seamlessly switch between the stats view and back again. Sworkit and OneGoal are filled with custom components, but let's just take a quick look and have a bit of an overview of some of the key components that both applications provide. So with Sworkit, we have the activity calendar. There are custom announcement modals, activity rings, timer rings, form control rings, upcoming exercises, a timeline list. And for OneGoal, we have drag and drop transactions, exploding budgets, confetti celebrations, slide-in transactions, custom loading animations, a color to icon selector transition for themes, animated numbers, and there is still far more customization in both of these apps. So this is the level of attention to detail necessary to create an application that looks great and creates a great user experience. If you want to check out Sworkit or OneGoal for yourself, I've included links in the description. If you want to follow Cory's progress on OneGoal, you can find updates on indie hackers, which I'll also link below. Cory will now also be working with Table Needs to help create a contactless dining experience through a PWA, so expect to see some great stuff there as well. And finally, if you liked this video, please feel free to leave a like and subscribe. I hope your users leave your app nothing but 5-star reviews, and I will see you in the next video.